Hello again for an interview with Reverend James Bhagwan, General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. James, it's good to have you back here. In our last interview, you briefly mentioned the issue of loss and damage. It's totally clear that now that the climate emergency is striking the Pacific Island countries, there has to be adaptation and there has to be finance for adaptation. And last COP, in COP27, they have decided to have a new financial mechanism for loss and damage. So my understanding is that COP28 that you are going to attend will also debate how to proceed with financial support for those countries affected by climate change-induced loss and damage. Take Cyclone Lola only recently that devastated Vanuatu. So what's your hope with regard to loss and damage and financing for loss and damage at COP28?
Thank you, Volker. And again, a pleasure to be with you for this Talanoa. We've seen the global the Green Climate Fund struggling to get the commitments and get the money that's needed. And so while that's been a challenge, we see that the discussions since particularly COP26 in Glasgow, bringing in the support of not just states but subnational groups, and that was kicked off really by Scotland during the Glasgow COP to put money in for loss and damage. We've seen that in terms of adaptation, there's too much focus on bilateral funding. So money is not going into the main bucket, as we can say, for adaptation. It's being used as a development tool. It's part of the new geopolitical situation, the Pacific Cold War, where money is coming in different spaces, but not being used for where it should be going. And it's sold as adaptation, but not really adaptation money. It's more development funding. What we're looking at in terms of loss and damage is that vulnerable countries need direct access to grant-based funding. This case was made very clearly last year and again this year as civil society and community groups gathered for the development and the launch of the Kato Fund, which is a Pacific community-based loss and damage fund. And this is about ensuring that funds get to the local communities that are needed, rather than being stuck with states. So while there are bigger amounts that can be distributed to states, they get chewed up in bigger projects, and there is a need to ensure that funds come directly to our local communities. And these are often smaller amounts, which also require perhaps less stringent processes or less time-consuming processes. And the funds need to be allocated in terms of severity of need. Loss and damage can be applied to developing countries as well, but it's about who's being affected most in that context. And there's a concern that developed countries will take advantage of this loss and damage framing to, for example, instead of giving funds to the more affected communities, use it in their own cases. So if you have a wildfire in Australia or the US, then it gets used up there under loss and damage. So making sure that it comes into that space. And also the initial capital needs to come from the developed countries as well. So they're looking, I'm sure, and we're trying to figure out where the funding will come from. We have things like the IMO shipping levy that's being mooted at the moment, but that really is not so much about collecting money. It's about decarbonizing the maritime industry, as I alluded to in our last interview. So, in terms of loss and damage financing, that's one aspect. And the other aspect is how to support the non-economic loss and damage, which is sometimes a bit more harder to quantify.
Yes, can you a little bit elaborate on this dimension of non-economic loss and damage. I think this is often not really understood in the so-called Western developed world, what really the effects of climate change to the people in the Pacific mean in terms of non-economic, non-material loss and damage.
Thank you. When we talk about non-economic loss and damage, we are talking about things that it's not that they're not able to be necessarily quantified financially. It's about that they don't step out. So we're not talking about the industries, the effect of climate change on destruction or devastation of agriculture and GDP aspects. We're looking at those non-economic well-being aspects that are being affected. Key to this is recognizing what are those aspects of well-being that don't necessarily have an economic perspective to them, or don't factor in, GDP in terms of gross domestic products, etc. And so what we're talking about here is the cultural, the spiritual, the psychosocial trauma that communities go through in this case. And recognizing that dealing with these things require a sustained approach. They require a contextual or contextualized approach, they're not national things. You cannot build something to deal with the issue. This is talking about how we work with people and communities who experience that physical loss and damage in a deep, deep way. So one is, of course, the psychological trauma. The second is, for people in the Pacific in particular, the cultural and spiritual trauma that they experience, which cannot be addressed by secular psychosocial trauma counseling. So, it's about developing those responses. It's about, designing the processes that go into these things. And how do you ensure that these are ongoing processes? So it's not a matter of just visiting a community for a day or a week and doing a workshop on counseling. It's how do you help them in that process of grieving, in the way that they grieve, not the Western way, not a secular way, but honoring their cultural way of grieving, their spiritual way of grieving. How do we build resilience in that space as well? How do we go through those aspects? And this will increase as we start to have people being relocated, displaced. What are those cultural protocols that need to be developed to deal with these issues? So it's about developing and designing those things. It's about training our pastors, our matuas, or our community leaders, our traditional leaders in these processes, and then sustaining and maintaining these things. And the question then comes to who pays for all of this? Because you can't expect the community that's been affected to pay for this. Somebody has to pay for this. And so we want to bring that into the aspect of loss and damage. And, we're looking at how do you deal with loss of biodiversity or loss of sacred items, sacred grove, sacred parts of the ocean or the coast, etc. Looking at the processes of that and trying to figure out in some way what that, not so much compensation, because you can't really compensate for these non-economic things that have much deeper meaning and perhaps are priceless. But how do you develop a cost for the processes and the implementations that help deal with these things?
Thank you very much, James, and all the best for your participation in COP28. It will be very interesting to talk to you again after COP28 and to learn about your experiences there. Thanks again so much for taking your time.